There's a further question kind of lurking in the background, which I've never raised, but really ought to be. It's not a very profound question. And that is, what right do we have to do anything in Colombia? Try out new biological weapons, use chemicals in violation of manufacturers' prescriptions, go in with military gunships. What right do we have to do any of these things? And there's a cynical answer to that. The cynical answer is their governments asked us to. But if the governments hadn't asked us to, they wouldn't be their governments. So we can drop that argument. Putting that aside, what's our right? What right do we have to do it? Or to turn the question around, do they have the same right to do it to us? Like, let's just take, say, Colombia. Many more people die in Colombia from U.S. Lethal drugs than the number of people who die here from Colombian lethal drugs. And if you spread it over the whole world, it's orders of magnitude. I mean, millions and millions of people in Asia die from U.S.-produced lethal substances, as do many people here. I'm talking about tobacco primarily. The number of deaths from tobacco every year just in the United States is on the order of 400,000. The total number of deaths from all drugs, what are called drugs, is about 16,000, so it's like 25 times as much. If you look at the rest of the world, it's millions and tens of millions of people. Now, notice that those people, they don't have a choice. For example, if Thailand or China or South Korea or something were to try to prevent U.S. lethal substances from going into their country, they'd be smashed. There's a device called Super 301, trade sanction, very severe trade sanctions will be imposed. In fact, they're constantly threatened if any effort is made to try to prevent the import of U.S. lethal substances. And that's a very severe threat for a country like, say, Thailand or even China, a big one, because the U.S. market is important. So you can compel countries to accept our lethal substances. Furthermore, they have to accept advertising for them. So if any of these countries try to prevent advertising, mostly directed at vulnerable populations, like, say, women and children primarily, if they try to prevent that, again, very severe trade sanctions. The result of this is that U.S. lethal substances are poured into other countries with massive advertising campaigns aimed at the most vulnerable populations, leading to a huge number of deaths, incalculable number of deaths. One epidemiologist at Oxford University estimated that of the current population of China, about 50 million are going to die from U.S. lethal substances in the coming years. So it's not small numbers. So then the question then arises, well, if we have a right to carry out these campaigns in Colombia, why don't they have a right to carry out chemical and biological warfare and military attacks, say, in North Carolina? It sounds like a simple question, and if the U.S. Air Force won't let them do it, why shouldn't honest American citizens do it? Because they can ask the same question. Well, I'll leave that question with you to think about. It's rather striking that it isn't asked. It's not a very profound question. Like it's not a question that any junior high school student would have difficulty understanding. But try to find the question raised somewhere. You can ask why. Notice that there is no debate about the character of U.S. lethal drugs. That's accepted. The U.S. Supreme Court really recently determined, in fact unanimously, that tobacco is the leading public health hazard in the United States. It outweighs a huge number of others combined. And they virtually called on Congress to declare it illegal. They can't actually say so, but that's what it amounted to. Other questions arise, too. How many times recently have you heard about Delta Force raids on, say, U.S. chemical companies in New York or U.S. banks in New York or Boston and so on? If not, why not? It's well known that they're involved in narco-trafficking, heavily involved. In the 1980s, the CIA published a report, in fact, on chemical exports from the United States to Latin America, pointing out that they're way in excess of industrial needs, and that the ones that are sent are the kind that are used for production of drugs. So what about that? Nobody knows how much money goes into narco-trafficking, but it's supposed to be in the order of, maybe $500 billion a year or something like that. It's estimated that over half of it passes through New York banks, U.S. banks. Well, that's not very hard to monitor. In fact, the Federal Reserve System is so well enough organized so that if any deposit of over $10,000 enters anywhere, it's registered. And that can be monitored. In fact, it was done at one point. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, when drug production was really picking up fast in Colombia, nothing like lethal substance production here, it's not a fraction of it, but was mounting. There was an operation. Federal prosecutors in Florida detected sharp increases in the deposits in Florida banks and began an operation called Operation Greenback to determine what it was, although of course everybody knew what it was, to find out what it was and to bring criminal charges against the people involved. Well, that operation was called off by the drug czar of the Reagan administration, a guy named George Bush, and that's the last time there was ever an attempt to look at that. There's much more to be said about this. Of the non-tobacco lethal substances, the one that's fastest growing, the sector that's growing most rapidly is the high-tech drugs, what are called ATS, stands for, I can never remember it, so I wrote it down, amphetamine-type stimulants. There's supposedly about 30 million people, addicts a year. That's more than heroin, cocaine combined. They're mostly produced here, and it's rapidly growing. So there are things we could do. There's another point, and I'll end with this. This is enough to say that whatever's going on has nothing to do with drugs. Some other purpose, and I think it's obvious what the purpose is. But there's a final point to be made about that. It's well known how to deal with drug problems. It's not a small problem. Substance abuse is a serious problem. The worst part is tobacco. The next is alcohol, and down below are lots of other drugs. And the way to deal with it is by treatment. Prevention and treatment. Prevention, of course, means eliminating the social conditions out of which it arises, but just plain treatment. And it's effective. There are major studies which compare the effectiveness, government-funded studies, major ones, that compare the effectiveness of treatment to other approaches. The major one by Rand Corporation compared treatment, prevention and treatment, just in terms of cost effectiveness, to criminal justice, I hate to use the word, what's called criminal justice in the United States, and it was about 7 times as effective treatment. They compared it with interdiction. It's about 11 times as effective. They compared it with what's called source country control. That's what we're doing in Colombia. It was 23 times as effective. So by substantial measures, these are much more effective ways of dealing with the substance abuse problem, which is a problem, and you want to deal with it, that's the way to do it. There were some proposals from the Office of Budget Management and also from a couple of congressional representatives, Nancy Pelosi in California particularly, to put in amendments to the Colombia plan for small amounts of money for treatment. And they're killed. That's not the idea. The idea isn't to use the cost-effective methods to treat the problem that exists. It's to kill peasants. And that's the plan that was passed. Well, for years it's been pointed out by critics of these programs that they fail to meet their stated objectives. And that's true. They completely fail to meet their stated objectives. And that's recognized on all sides. So what do we conclude? What do you decide when a program fails to meet the stated objectives? The methods are criminal prosecution at home and mass murder abroad. Well, what you do is you intensify the same efforts and you avoid the methods that you know to work. Well, assuming everybody isn't totally insane, there's another conclusion to be drawn from this, and that is that they are meeting their objectives, not their stated objectives, but the real objectives. They're meeting them, and therefore you continue with them, and you don't carry out programs that would meet the stated objectives. What are the objectives? Well, to make sure that social change of the wrong kind doesn't take place in countries like Colombia, and to get rid of the superfluous population in the United States. The United States is also being subjected to neoliberal structural adjustment programs. That's in Colombia, it leads to a class of people called disposable. In the United States, it leads to superfluous people who aren't making a significant contribution to wealth production and really aren't needed in what's called the new economy. So you toss them in jail. We're a civilized country, so instead of killing them, you toss them into jail. The jail population is shooting out of sight. In the last 20 years, it's become way beyond any industrial country. Any other industrial country. It has nothing whatsoever to do with crime. In fact, most of the people by now are what are called victimless crimes, possession, things like that. So domestic, in the foreign domains, it's clear what the consequences are. Domestically, it's basically a war directed against minorities and the poor, and it gets rid of them. And it has a secondary effect of terrifying everybody else. A lot of people are suffering from the neoliberal programs. So although small sectors of the population have gained from the rather tepid economic growth of the last 20 years, most of them are left out. And they got to be controlled too, and the best way to control people is by fear. That's every dictator, everyone else knows that. If you can frighten people, they're not going to cause too much problems. And the drug war is perfect for that. It makes people frightened, willing to accept authority and power, gets rid of people who are in your way, and provides a cover for the kinds of actions abroad that have been carried out for years under one or another pretext, but always the same. I think that's the framework in which it makes sense to think about and come to understand the Colombia plan. Do here.